Thanks so much for making this work. We have an amazing audience for you, and thanks everybody for still being here with us. For some context, for Vitalik, today we have conference attendees as well as hackathon participants all in the same room. And after this talk, we'll have a couple more workshops, and then we kick off the hackathon itself. With that said, I want to kind of just give a brief kind of index of what's going to happen for the next sort of 45 to 60 minutes. I have a handful of questions for Vitalik that I'm going to ask him, and after those questions, we'll do an open Q&A session. So if you have any questions that you would like to ask Vitalik, you can sort of either raise your hands, we'll come with a microphone, or you can tweet them out with the hashtag ETHIndia or at ETHIndiaCo, and we'll kind of find them on Twitter, and then I'll just ask them directly to Vitalik. So with that said, please welcome Vitalik to join us for ETHIndia 2019. This is an amazing event. This is our second time doing this thing, and the best part of this weekend is that 68% of the hackers are new to Ethereum. So I'm super excited to welcome all of them here and have them kind of be here in the audience for this talk. So I want to...
We're here this time around.
Can we raise... If you were here at last year, can you raise your hand? And we'll try to see if we can focus the camera. That's probably 5%. I see like maybe 12 to 15 hands. So that's a good thing.
Great progress. Yay, India.
Okay, so what I want to start off by is kind of going over some of the history. So a few days ago was the 4th birthday of Ethereum, the project. Could you go over how the project started and sort of how it came to be, and generally kind of from your experience from Bitcoin to Bitcoin Magazine to Ethereum, what did that journey look like, and how did you get to starting Ethereum?
Sure. So I first discovered Bitcoin around the beginning of 2011. My dad told me about it, and then separately I just found about it while browsing on the internet a couple of weeks later. And so I thought, okay, this thing seems to be interesting. I should go check it out. At the time, the Bitcoin community was really tiny. There was just this fairly small crew of developers and enthusiasts. They were all concentrated around this Bitcoin Talk forum. And I just thought, hey, why can't I try to actually participate more in this community? So what I did is I went on these forums and started looking for places where people would pay me in Bitcoin to do things. And eventually I found this guy who was running a blog who would pay me 5 Bitcoins, which back then was about $4 to write articles for him. So I did that for a bit. Then eventually someone else, Mihai, reached out to me and asked me to join Bitcoin Magazine. So I did that. So I was writing for Bitcoin Magazine and part-time while I was still finishing high school, starting university. I would be getting more and more involved in more Bitcoin projects over time. I was involved in a covered coins thing. I was involved in a thing that was using Bitcoin transactions to do something similar to non-fungible tokens. And this was around in 2013 when the second big bubble happened. I had decided to take a break from university and go into doing Bitcoin things full time. And I started getting more and more interested in this idea that, hey, we have blockchains and blockchains work great for cryptocurrency, but can we use them for applications that go beyond the simple cryptocurrency and simple payments as well? And there were already some projects that were trying to do this. So one of the simpler ones was, as I mentioned, Colored Coins, which was trying to just issue digital assets on top of the Bitcoin blockchain. Another one was called Mastercoin. And these protocols were basically using the Bitcoin blockchain as this data layer to store data about transactions. And there would be this separate protocol where you could interpret this data and use it to try to figure out who actually owns a particular token at some particular point in time now. So I worked with these projects for a while, and I quickly realized that the possibilities for building things on top of a blockchain were much larger and much more general purpose than the things that they were building. And so I had the idea of let's have a blockchain protocol with a built-in programming language. So instead of just concentrating on a small number of features and sticking each individual feature into the protocol, we could instead have this programming language so that whatever application you wanted to write, you could write it inside of this programming language, upload it to the blockchain, and the blockchain would execute the rules of the application for you. And so that was the basic idea behind Ethereum. I came up with that, published the idea, and it sort of went from there.
So one kind of question there is, what was that moment, or what made you actually sort of leave school or kind of focus all of your attention to making sure Ethereum becomes a thing? Like, was there a turning point? Were there some events? What kind of made you get that conviction?
So the turning point was actually even before I started Ethereum. It was when I went to the San Jose Bitcoin conference. And this was the first big Bitcoin conference, and there were about 1,000 people there. And that was when I realized that, like, hey, Bitcoin isn't just a couple of jokers trolling each other on forums on the internet. There's actually real things here, a lot of real people, real businesses, a lot of people like trying hard to make it work. And this seems like something that was going to continue to exist and will continue to grow, and seemed like as good a bet as any to just try to sink a bit more of my time on to try to understand it fully.
Awesome. When you thought about wanting to add programming and just kind of programming language to a blockchain, did you foresee the kind of the barriers we'll see in terms of technical scalability, or in general any kind of upper bounds to what would or would not be possible?
And I knew that scalability was a big issue. And scalability doesn't have like that much to do with whether or not a blockchain is programmable. It's more about like, hey, if you have a platform where every single computer needs to process and verify every single transaction, then the capacity of the system is limited to the capacity of a single computer. And that's something that I did realize very early on, and I did put scalability on the Ethereum roadmap fairly early on. And I had this vague idea in my head that, with advanced math and science and cryptography and other things, we could eventually figure out a way to do something blockchain-like, but without that restriction, sort of something halfway in between a simple blockchain where everyone sees everything and something like BitTorrent, where you have a already highly sharded and highly distributed network, but you just don't have consensus. And you're trying to come up with something that is sort of in the middle of those two. So that was definitely something that I was thinking about early on, had ideas about early on, and there were kind of early attempts at me writing papers about scalability in 2014 and 2015. And the basic idea behind sharding was there pretty early, but it definitely has taken a while to reach maturity, though I would say at this point we do have a very good grasp of kind of how those scalability solutions work in theory, though obviously the thing remains is actually trying them out in practice on live networks and seeing how they end up working in that setting.
We'll dig into a bit more of scaling in later in the talk. That's kind of how you started Ethereum. And back then, the tagline was, "This is the world's computer." How do you kind of compare and contrast that to where things were back then and where they are now, and where is it going as a project from your standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, now I think we have a lot more concrete ideas about the applications people can build on Ethereum. Back then, the kind of branding was definitely all about, it's this open green field and you can do pretty much anything on top of it. And there were definitely specific things that people were trying to kind of push towards. Like there were projects around crowdfunding around DAOs very early on, projects around things like decentralized file storage and all these different ideas. So there were definitely specific things happening, but there was also this much bigger feeling that the things that are going to be the biggest we haven't really discovered yet. And now I definitely feel like things have become a lot more concrete in many ways. Like, we're seeing decentralized finance obviously get fairly big, and also non-financial applications getting interesting. So the one that I kind of like and always talk about fairly recently is forget the name now, but the one based out of Singapore that's OpenCerts, that's using the Ethereum blockchain to do certificate verification and certificate revocation. So the idea here would be that if you have some certificate, like could be a university degree, could be something else, then to issue it, you would get this digital signature proving that it was issued. And if a certificate gets revoked, then the revocation would be published on the blockchain. And so if you want to check that a certificate exists, but that it hasn't been revoked yet, you would just check the signature and then check the blockchain to verify that their certificate is still valid. If both of those checks pass, then yay. Otherwise, either it was never issued correctly or it was revoked. And there are things like ENS happening now. There's things like different DAO designs, different designs around incentives, even things like social media applications that people are trying to experiment with. So definitely a lot of kind of much more concrete, cool stuff happening right now. And also in terms of narratives, like before, the focus was definitely on if you can do anything. Well, now the focus is more on kind of specific categories of things. And there's definitely many specific categories, and new ones definitely keep getting added on all the time, because that's just what happens in a decentralized platform. But like, you do hear people talking concretely about decentralized finance, concretely about just Ether itself as a cryptocurrency, concretely about these specific kinds of non-financial applications, concretely about DAO designs. And that's been a really interesting step forward to watch and participate in.
No, it's a lot of things to dig in on. I'll maybe ask a meta question here. When people think about decentralized apps, do you think you need to fundamentally think about a whole new way of approaching a problem, or mentally it's more about saying we know how something works right now and we just need to convert this to be a bit more decentralized or trustless? And does that limit what can and cannot be possible?
Yeah, and there's definitely value in both approaches. So like OpenCerts, for example, is definitely very much in the incremental school. It basically says, here's the thing we're doing now. We're going to keep doing it, but we're going to add a blockchain component to make it more secure. Something like DAOs are definitely much more of the sort of think from scratch school of thought. Basically, the idea there is just the problem, decentralized governance, the solution. Well, there's lots of possible ones. Let's figure out which ones work. So I definitely think the figure things out from scratch and make things very different to what already exists approach is one that is needed, because like ultimately decentralization by itself is not going to bring millions of users on board. What is going to bring millions of users on board is fundamentally new and superior ways of doing things that are enabled by decentralization. And so like the idea of just starting from scratch and saying, if we had these decentralized databases, if we had globally shared state, if you have internet native money, then given these ingredients already existing, how would you build the thing that you would be building and start, without kind of that much regard for the way things exist now, and start from there and then evolve from there over time. then that kind of approach is definitely one that I think has a lot of promise, and we do need to be putting a lot of thinking into. And I think Uniswap, for example, is one great example of that style of thinking, right? There are no traditional platforms pretty much anywhere that work on this kind of constant product X times Y equals K market maker model. And Uniswap did it, and it just turns out to be really fast and really efficient. And you just collect and swap, and the UI is better than most of the centralized exchanges, and it just works. So things of that flavor are definitely things that we should also be looking into.
No, that's amazing. For those of you who don't know Uniswap, check out uniswap.io that lets you trade tokens for different pairs in a decentralized form. It's an amazing app that we've seen in the last year. How do you kind of think about making it easy for people to experiment and try out and try to make things that can get users while also still abiding with what the platform can do now versus where it can be, and sort of from the point of view of somebody who's maintaining that platform, how do you make that better for the end users without knowing or supporting a specific case at all times?
So is the question focused on scalability issues, or
scalability, feedback on how you improve the language, to how do you understand what the users want? How do you support something that's so big and so general, and what's a good way to think about that?
Yeah, I mean, in some cases, I think the fact that we're a general purpose platform definitely means that we have to work differently than other kinds of platforms. If you asked the builders of C++ or Python, what is the vision for society that they seek to enact through the development of those technologies? They can definitely say things about empowering people and improving the world with better programs and better technology and these kind of nice, fairly broad things, but it's hard to make specific features of things like C++ and Python to benefit specific kinds of applications. And in many ways, Ethereum is kind of in the same bind. It's a thing that's definitely fundamentally going to be shaped by its users much more than by its developers. So that's sort of one limitation that we should be keeping in mind. Though the one kind of category of users that I do think Ethereum protocol developers have been in contact with and probably should be in contact with even more is application developers, because application developers are the ones that are using the Ethereum platform directly and for whom changes in the Ethereum platform could make life significantly better or significantly worse for them. So that's
just for clarification. Application developer is just anybody who's deploying something on Ethereum, or a specific set of
people building smart contracts, people building dApps.
Got it.
Yeah.
And kind of, I guess, speaking for challenges around scalability and supporting bigger use cases, could you talk about the plan for how Ethereum is thinking about scaling and in general what ETH 2.0 is?
Sure. So ETH 2.0 is this set of upgrades that we've been working to for Ethereum for a long time, where the two kind of flagship features are one, proof of stake, which is this consensus mechanism that does not require mining and instead relies on basically people who hold Ether to sign up as validators and then sign make signatures of blocks that they considered to be part of the chain, and using a kind of PBFT-inspired consensus algorithm to force the chain to progress over time. And the other is sharding, which is this approach to scalability, which, as I mentioned, in the one sentence, sort of philosophical model here is traditional blockchains where everyone validates everything, have great replication and great security, but very low scalability. BitTorrent has great scalability but it doesn't have a consensus mechanism, so it can't be used for things like a cryptocurrency. So let's create something that's kind of halfway in between the two. So you have some more data, but probably not quite as much data as BitTorrent. Have the network kind of keep the data and make sure that the data stays available, but don't require every single computer to process, verify, and store every single transaction. Instead, we would break the transactions up into shards, which basically means into about 1,024 different kind of pieces or subzones or whatever you want to call them, where each individual node in the network would only be responsible for processing and verifying one or at most a few of them. So the idea there is that if you do that, then the total scalability of the system can be significantly higher than the scalability of any one node in the system. So we aim to increase kind of base chain scalability that way by maybe about a factor of 1,000. So that's so ETH 2.0 is the kind of one part of the kind of path that we've been thinking through. The other important part of the path is layer 2 protocols. So one of the idea behind layer 2 protocols is basically that you try to increase the scalability of chain-based applications by doing some things on-chain that have to be on-chain, but trying to do as much off-chain that you can. And the general principle here in general is that the only things that go on-chain are basically three categories of things. One is people entering your particular layer 2 subsystem. The second is people leaving your subsystem. And the third is disputes. So if people disagree, or if one person or one participant kind of accidentally or maliciously acted not according to the protocol in some way, then you drag things on chain and you use smart contracts on chain to figure out what should have happened. But if there aren't any disputes, then things just keep on happening off chain. So state channels are one good example of this, and their main kind of flagship benefit is like almost zero latency and the ability to do a huge number of transactions between two or a small number of participants. Another example of this is Plasma, where you have off-chain chains whose data gets kind of Merkle tree hashed into the chain, and you have logic for kind of adjudicating between different claims. A third kind of layer 2s that I've been pushing lately is layer 2 protocols that push data on chain, but that keep computation off chain, because computation tends to be more expensive than data. And then the idea here is that if you push data on-chain, then you have guarantees about which pieces of data are available and which pieces of data are not available. And it turns out that if you have that, then it becomes much, much easier to build these layer 2 constructions that adjudicate and figure out kind of what's right and what's wrong if there's a disagreement about the result of some computation on the data, because basically, you know the data's there, so you know that you can prove that someone's right, or you can prove that someone's wrong, and whoever's wrong, you can penalize them much more, and all of those things. So it becomes easier to build these mechanisms, and you can sometimes even avoid this kind of interactive challenging by using zero-knowledge proofs, right? So the ZK rollup is one example of this that I've been promoting a lot, and Barry Whitehead's been doing a lot of really good work on implementing. And with ZK rollup, the idea is basically that you publish the chain a description of how the state of your subsystem has changed. So this will just be like a list of what are the accounts, what are their new balances, and you use this zero knowledge proof, a ZK snark, to basically verify and say this Merkle hash of the state and apply to it the state changes leads to a state that has this other Merkle hash. And so on chain, you keep on using these proofs to verify validity. You make sure the deltas get published on chain to verify availability, to verify that anyone can calculate the state if they want it. And you go from there, right? So ZK rollup by itself can increase scalability to about 500 transactions a second. With the call data reduction, call data gas cost reduction, EIP, it looks like it could end up going over 1,000 just with the current ETH1 chain. And I know it's gone over 100 transactions a second on mainnet already, pretty recently. So that's one example. Another thing is this idea that I kind of vaguely came up and never, really kind of took to fruition. It was something called shadow chains that was in this blog post in 2014. And the idea with shadow chains is it's basically equivalent to ZK rollup, except instead of using snarks, it's using fraud proofs. And so the benefit there is it's simpler. The cost there is that you have to wait for 2 weeks in order to exit. So both of those kinds of things are worth trying, and you can generalize those things more easily. So I think the long-term idea is that Ethereum 2.0 as this general purpose platform and these layer 2 scalability techniques, are all going to end up kind of working together. And if you do that, then you can push the scalability of the whole thing potentially really high if you want to the point where I don't think that we're going to need kind of more than Ethereum 2.0 for a long time, and possibly never.
No, that makes sense. And I'm starting to get a lot of questions from the audience. So I'll start mixing them in as well. And so I'll kind of comment on one question that's related to what you just said. I guess if you were to build Ethereum from scratch again, what would you design differently on the protocol?
My answer to this is obviously I would start with the Ethereum 2.0 design, because that's what Ethereum 2.0 ultimately is a reflection of our opinions of what an optimally designed blockchain would look like. But if we didn't have the resources to do sharding immediately, for example, then there's definitely kind of partial versions of Ethereum 2.0 where you would start off with, say, 8 shards and then require all of the nodes to download all of them, and then you would increase the shard count over time once you're ready. So starting with kind of something very similar to the Ethereum 2.0 design is definitely, I think, what the answer would be.
Good. One other question from from a comment from Uniswap is, do you own Unisocks, which are the socks that Uniswap gives out?
Yeah, I bought one. It was around $40 when I bought it, and now it's around $60. So, it looks like a good stock.
Well, Arnav, your question has been answered. In terms of the timeline for seeing these changes for 8.2.0, what does that look like in the near term? And for context, 8.2.0 launch is divided into certain phases. So there's phase 0, phase 1, phase 2. What do these timelines look like for us to see the full deployment of the new chain?
Sure. So first of all, I guess to summarize the progress up until now, there was a spec freeze for phase 0 of Ethereum 2.0, which basically is the part that does proof of stake. Phase 1 of 2.0, we're hoping for a spec freeze fairly soon. And all of the components in phase 1 are basically written and there, but they still needs to be tested and debugged and checked over by more people and all of those things. So, in terms of kind of principles wise, phase 0 and phase 1 are basically kind of there in terms of what they would look like. In terms of development, there's been multiple test nets for phase 0 for months now, and the next major milestone is an interoperable test net between the different implementations. And that's something that still seems to be expected in around a couple of months. And so then at the same time, we're starting to figure out things like doing more testing, doing more auditing and verification and all of those things. And we're definitely hoping for a launch very early next year of a phase 0. And for phase 1, what's happening is that some of the clients developers are starting to do work toward making a phase 1 testnet in parallel to the phase 0 work that's starting to finish up right now. So that would help us get a lot of kind of information and feedback earlier on, specifically about sharding, which is something that would be really interesting and I'm looking forward to. So that's probably the next major step. And we'll expect phase 1 to be rolled out at some point next year. And phase 2 is already very far along being developed and thought about in parallel.
Great. In terms of other projects that are around in this space, we're now starting to see other smart contract platforms, kind of big corporations launching their own platforms as well. Do you see them differently in terms of how they want to present their goals as becoming a decentralized platform? And more specifically, what are your thoughts on Libra?
Yeah, and I think there's like a few different categories of non-Ethereum smart contract platforms out there. Like, one of them is obviously just the kind of really crazy ones that just rely much more on marketing than technical talent. And like, I've yelled at those people publicly enough, so there's probably not even any more points in talking about them right now. There are other technically, Tron is one. I mean, EOS is kind of marketing heavy though, and I have a bit more respect for it because it's also kind of trying out delegated proof of stake as a technical hypothesis, and it's one that I disagree with for a bunch of reasons I've published on my website. But it's still, like, they're trying something, and there's like a bunch of newer ones, but in terms of the ones I consider really technically interesting, I mean, Definity is one, and so Dominic has been around for a long time, and he's been thinking about a consensus mechanism design for a while. And Definity is definitely taking an approach that's kind of somewhat more performance oriented, whereas Ethereum is more kind of decentralization and do kind of catch up on the performance at layer 2 oriented. And they've done a lot of pioneering work on making BLS signatures work better, and their entire chain is based on BLS signatures in really clever ways. I mean, Near is interesting. They've been trying out kind of different ideas around how to do a verification of scalable data. I mean, I know like Solana is interesting. They're taking a non-charted approach, which seems like it'll be considerably less scalable, but it'll still retain the benefits of being a kind of single thread where everything can talk to everything else synchronously, and basically kind of pushing that approach to the limits. So, there's definitely some that are kind of trying out different technical hypotheses, and it's definitely good that these different things exist. Another one is, of course, kind of enterprise chains in general. And
what about Libra?
Yeah, so Libra is the kind of fourth category. I mean, Libra is interesting because Libra's basically trying to be halfway in between an enterprise chain and something Ethereum-like in a bunch of ways. And for them, the kind of technical need that I think it's solving is basically that Facebook wants to get into payments, and a blockchain is the kind of regulatorily easiest way to get into payments to the extent that they want to get into payments. And like they have to make it decentralized because there's been kind of so much fear around Facebook as this kind of evil centralized actor that wants to kind of be your big brother and see everything about you and your social relations. So, and them kind of trying to make this be a corporate consortium instead of just a regular plain old product run by themselves kind of makes sense as a PR move from that standpoint. Though, I mean, you could argue that they haven't been very successful at that. in terms of whether or not it will succeed, like ultimately, I guess the most important insight is that technologically speaking, Libra doesn't differ from something like today's Ethereum by that much. So it's definitely not a technological play. It's a play, kind of political play, and a kind of leverage their existing users and network effect play. And so whether or not the experiment will succeed ultimately depends on like business and political factors much more than it depends on technology. And business and political factors are just always fairly hard to predict. So I don't know.
There's definitely a lot of politics around introducing and sort of launching something at that scale, especially with a lot of the conversations that are going on in India around regulation of cryptocurrencies. Do you have any comments on sort of how regulation may affect the future of this space here or in general?
Yeah, and I think the main thing that regulation has the power to affect is basically the kind of ease of use of regular people entering the space. Because, like, ultimately, if blockchains get made completely illegal, like, there's plenty of ways that people can just get around that from a point of view of just running software and sending transactions to each other. But the thing that you can't do is make it something that's convenient enough to the point where it can actually reach like large portions of a country's population. So, and I get the feeling that kind of in general around the world politicians see that, and that's kind of the frame that things are being kind of approached with at this point. So it's basically not about killing the technology. It's about like, do we not create a kind of regulatory firewall so the stuff can't be significantly used in the economy. And like they do have a lot of leverage there, right? Like even just banning exchanges, like limiting what exchanges can do, or even without banning anything, just kind of quietly talking to the banks and getting banks to just ban things. The like big cryptocurrency exchange themselves is definitely something that they can do. So yeah, and things are definitely looking kind of fairly uncertain in a lot of places, just because the technology is still fundamentally new, and also because the kind of specific concrete applications haven't quite kind of proven themselves out yet. So, we still haven't really seen blockchain applications get used at very large scales pretty much at all. And the closest thing that we have to that is basically people holding and using cryptocurrency. And I mean, we're obviously aware that this space is so much more than that, but kind of the so much more is coming, but it hasn't really come yet. So, and what that next phase is going to look like, I think, is definitely going to end up having a pretty big impact on things.
Oh, thanks for that. One last question before we go to the audience. If you were at this hackathon this weekend, what kind of project would you like to build or see?
So the kinds of projects that I would find interesting are, I mean, in general, kind of solutions to things that I consider kind of higher level problems of the space. And so one of the things that I talk about is kind of secure solutions to user account security. So things around multi-sig wallets, like smart contract wallets, making smart contract wallets easier to use. Another would be anything in the privacy area. And there's been a lot of work done by Barry Whitehead and some a lot of good work by some other independent people in that area as well, but trying to just make it easier to build more privacy preserving applications. A third would probably be kind of layer 2 solutions, and especially these layer 2 solutions that have to do with kind of keeping data on chain and computation off chain, just because those are much easier to build, require less infrastructure, and even though they're potentially less powerful in terms of raw numbers, there's just so much you can do with them that haven't been explored. So I'd recommend looking up ZK Rollup, looking up OPM, looking up shadow chains, and probably looking up TrueBit as well, and all of those things, and seeing if there's something to be come up with.
Is there any DeFi application that you think is cool that hasn't been done before?
Let's see. Synthetics I think are interesting, and people have been trying to do them, but no one has done that and really well into general purposely yet. Here's another interesting one. So there's been some project, this isn't in the DeFi area, but there's been some projects recently that have been trying to use like Ethereum wallets as a way of just logging into regular traditional web applications. So if you search on Twitter, Virgil Griffith has put up some links to those fairly recently. But the general idea is you just kind of use your Ethereum private key as your identity. And the nice thing about that is that then you have a way of logging into things that isn't kind of controlled by Google or Facebook or these other intermediaries. So the challenge is basically that currently works for single key wallets, but it would be nice to have a standardized way of extending that to smart contract wallets. So the benefit of that being that then you can multi-sig your logins. You can have a login that has some built-in feature where some other set of keys can be used to change the key to something that's used to authenticate an account to something else. So the idea there would be that instead of verifying a signature, you would require these user smart contract wallets to have a pure function that just says like verify signature, and that, or it doesn't have to be a pure function. The function could depend on the state of the smart contract, and it could depend on the blockchain. And so you would kind of call that function just from outside the chain, but then this would support these smart contract wallets where the logic for verifying and the keys used to verify could be changed, could be multi-sig, or could be pretty much whatever logic you want. Also in the DeFi area, general purpose decentralized oracles are still an interesting area and infrastructure-wise to look at. Going more specifically toward applications, I know that there has been a lot of interest in parametric insurance. So this is the idea of like specific kinds of insurance that give payouts based on events that you can figure out based on oracles that already exist on the internet. Like I know that there is one in Sri Lanka for crop insurance. So try to kind of make more similar things like that and see if there's things that kind of could be actually useful to like people in India or places around India fairly soon.
No, it's amazing. Actually, one thing I forgot to ask, and we'll kind of open the question here, is how important is India to you and the Ethereum Foundation?
India is definitely a place we want to do many more things in, and I've come I think 2 times so far. One time about like 2 years ago and last year I think, and it's definitely a place where we just don't have too many kind of contacts in yet, and we definitely want to try to get more contacts and help support local developer ecosystems and people building things much more. And so definitely looking forward to the foundation making much more of an effort to engage with India in the future.
Awesome. Hopefully we'll see you next year in person too. With that, we'll open up to the questions from the audience. If you have a question, just raise your hand. We'll get to you with a mic.
Hey Vitalik, I wanted to know, once Ethereum adopts proof of stake, what are the long-time concerns you might have?
Sure. So, I guess so. First of all, the short-term concern is that we just kind of estimate incorrectly people's willingness to lock up their coins and people's willingness to actually participate in the system and participate in the system honestly. Longer-term concern, I think centralization is probably at the top of the list. Are just given how people tend to be lazy, is it going to just naturally concentrate into everyone putting all of their coins into a few pools? And if so, is it going even more so, those pools going to just all end up running on the same cloud computing platform like AWS or whatever? And so trying to avoid that outcome is definitely one of the goals, but the extent to which we'll end up succeeding, we don't know. There's also long-term concerns around cryptocurrency in general. With anything where either you have a fixed supply or you don't have a fixed supply, but new units are ultimately going to people that already have units. Is that going to lead to more and more concentration over time? I don't know. And the crypto space as a whole probably still doesn't know. Yeah, so I guess things about centralization and concentration in different forms. They're my biggest concerns with proof of work too, as I've said many times, but they're definitely also my biggest concern with proof of stake.
Thank you.
Hey Vitalik, good morning. A question right now, DAG-based blockchains are like a next generation of the blockchain. First with the Bitcoin, then Ethereum, then decentralized applications, and then DAG-based blockchain. That is what I have heard through searching through internet and many other blogs. So will this DAG-based blockchain will affect the Ethereum in future, or what are your thoughts?
So Ethereum 2.0 basically will be a DAG-based blockchain. We don't use that word in our marketing, but that is what it is, right? If you look at the structure, it's a graph. You have a lot of different chains. You have a lot of different things happening in parallel to each other as well. So I think we'll be able to get those benefits.
Fine. Okay. And one more, why not in Ethereum version 2, their block rate per second is decreased. Right now it is 12 to 15 seconds, right? So why isn't a good idea to reduce the block rate? Few of the blockchains are producing the block at 1 second and 5 seconds like that, right? Mm-hmm. So why can't in Ethereum you implement such reduce the block rate?
Yeah, so we definitely do want to reduce the block time to something less than the current 14 seconds. And we're looking at numbers like 3 seconds and 6 seconds. The main reason to not go too far is basically the risk that will encourage centralization, and that will encourage everyone putting all of their nodes in the same place to decrease latency. Okay. But the main reason to do it is obviously that it increases usability.
Fine, okay. And the last question, if there wasn't Go during your time, which language would you prefer?
If there wasn't Go, which language would I prefer?
Yeah.
I think your choice of language should depend on what you're trying to do. If you're trying to just code things quickly, then Python tends to be very good. If you want something that's high performance, then, there's obviously the C and C++ family, there's Rust, there's these days there's a huge number of different choices. There's even these different ways to do optimized Python and all these other things. Yes. I think it's almost an aesthetic choice for the programmer more than anything else.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Hi, Vitalik. My name is Venkat. I got some small question because I'm newbie to the blockchain. Why did you name your blockchain as Ethereum instead of Buterin or Vitalik? And what was the story behind it?
I mean, the name Ethereum is basically kind of named after this idea, this scientific theory that was popular in the 19th century of ether, which basically says that like if water waves travel through water and sound waves travel through air, then there has to be something that light waves travel through. And it's this idea of this medium that's kind of permeating the entire universe, that is kind of invisible, but everything kind of ultimately runs on.
Okay, thank you.
And
I think Ethereum is just as cool as larding.
yay, larding.
Hi, Vitalik.
Hi.
What are your thoughts on token curated registries? We already have projects like Foam and AdChain building on token curated registries. What do you think?
Yeah, and it's definitely an interesting idea. My biggest concern is that the economics are untested. Like, are people actually going to vote honestly? Can voters be bribed? Can voters be manipulated? If some kind of bad answer gets included as a correct answer, like, would the system actually end up kind of forking to remove quote, the bad actors? Can you attack the system by having some substantial portion and committing to vote in a certain way? There's all of these kind of game theoretic and economic issues with the designs, and I don't feel like they've been adequately thought about and tested yet to the right extent.
Okay. Just following up on that, do you think like if we can design the game theory behind token curated registries, would it be possible to replace mining or proof of stake, and so that we can build blocks using token curated registries?
I mean, token curated registries are ultimately a form of proof of stake, right? So, I mean, like a form of proof of stake isn't going to replace proof of stake. It just is proof of stake.
Okay. I mean, like instead of transactions, can we have token curated registries as entries into each and every block?
I mean, sure you can, but I guess why?
Okay. Depending on the use case.
We'll move on to the next one.
Hey Vitalik, my question is, can you talk a little bit about the research that came out of Microsoft recently that's combining AI with blockchains, like training machine learning models on Ethereum?
I actually haven't looked into that yet, so I don't think I can really comment anything useful.
Okay. Another question that I want to ask, like, what's your advice for developers who fall outside the paid Infura plan?
I didn't hear the last 2 seconds, some mic issue. What was my advice for developers to what?
Who like fall outside the paid Infura plans, fall outside the free
The
Infura plans.
developers who are
Infura Plus, they came out of new paid pricing for everyone. Every developer uses Infura, and they came out of with paid versions of Infura.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wait, so what's the question about that?
So what's your advice for developers who fall outside of the free plan? Like they only allow like 100,000 requests per day, and like there's nothing.
I see.
the reliance on the platform. If you
I
can
see.
afford.
So, like, what should developers that make more than 100,000 queries a day do? I mean, one option is obviously to just pay for Infura. I mean, another option is to try to run the application in such a way that it doesn't depend on Infura as a centralized point of infrastructure. Like, I know there's projects that are starting to exist as alternatives. Like, I know there's one kind of Infura competitor that's just like Infura, but then I also know that there's these more decentralized approaches. Like, I think Incubed might be one. Like, there's these Ethereum ultralight clients, and you could try using those instead. Like, I actually feel like there hasn't been enough attention to those things.
We'll do 5 more questions, and for the sake of kind of keeping everything on time, 1 question per person.
Hi Vitalik. So, what are your views regarding the recent EIP 2025 discussion? So, do you think that is a way to, have more developers on board on the Ethereum network, or, what are your thoughts?
Okay, I guess I have to comment on this. I mean, I guess like I don't know. I'm I'm definitely kind of worried about some of these block reward funding initiatives, like basically because like they can just too easily devolve into these contests of like, hey, my group's working hard, we need money. My group's working hard, we need money, and I don't think that our governance mechanism is really well built to handle those kinds of questions. Like in general, like our approach to governance tends to kind of work well for technical things where most people agree on what a good answer is. But for these more controversial things, like we saw how much time we ended up spending on Prog Pow, we saw how much time we ended up spending on like all of these different iterations and attempts to get the parity multisig wallet unfrozen. So I'm like in the short, like I'm definitely not optimistic about putting the kind of apparatus of Ethereum governance directly in charge of the decision of which specific people to fund. And the thing that I would be more open to is, and first of all, a more general purpose mechanism. So something like putting like a block reward into something like the Gitcoin CLR if it ends up like working well and being robust, or kind of public good funding gadgets that are general purpose in the same way. Okay. Another thing that I would recommend is instead of putting issuance into rewards, put transaction fees into rewards, because like if you put issuance into rewards, it feels like there's no limit and you could just print more and more. Whereas if you put transaction fees into rewards, then there's a kind of natural limit, and so you're not kind of breaking the Schelling point, like you're not sort of opening up an unlimited Pandora's box in the same way, because there's just a natural limit to how many transaction fees there are. Okay. So, yeah, and I think both, I definitely kind of am happy that people are thinking about this stuff in theory, but yeah, I mean, I guess in the short term, like stability of governance is important, and kind of give people a credible signal that Ether, the cryptocurrency, is not going to have a monetary supply, a policy that goes crazy is also important. So I think there's very good arguments for conservatism too.
Okay. We have a question at the top.
Hello, Vitalik. Can you just share your thoughts on the fiat-backed cryptocurrencies, which are just coming up?
Yeah, I mean, in general, I think fiat-backed cryptocurrencies are cool, and I'm happy that they exist. And I definitely hope that more of them can exist in more kind of trustworthy formats, so that we don't have to worry about like, oh, is this entity actually trustworthy? Is it going to collapse at any moment? Are they secretly being a fractional reserve, and all of those things? And I do think some of the newer ones have been better in that regard. But you know, in general, I'm like happy that there are these attempts to try to put stable fiat-backed currencies into blockchains in different ways. I think it's all a positive development.
Hello, I am Ajay from ChainSafe Systems. Actually, when building the Loadster client, I have been going through many kinds of stuffs like Randao, like BLS cryptography, like custody game that you are using in phase 1. So how many of these works are actually academically proved? Because I'm seeing various kinds of cryptographic stuffs there, but actually how many of them are actually proved and they are actually stable? Because I know that before using any cryptographic systems, we should actually verify them for a time of at least 2 to 3 years or 4 years or more to get them the time to being stable. So what about them?
So for phases 0, 1, and 2, so basically everything so far, the only 2 pieces of cryptography, well, there's 3 pieces of cryptography that the chain is including. One of them is hashes, and hashes have been known to be secure for a long time. Another is BLS signatures with BLS aggregation and like proofs of possession. And that's something that's also been around for a long time and it's pretty stable. And the third thing is the VDF, but the VDF is definitely very novel, but on the other hand, we're not relying on the VDF for the protocols for security. It's just a kind of optional kind of extra that improves security and provides more a kind of resource to applications. And so I'm definitely in favor of being kind of conservative with cryptographic primitives.
Hey, hello. Yeah. Hi, Vitalik. My question is that you talked about decentralization and network effects. So my question is, how is Ethereum different from any other blockchain platforms in terms of network effects?
How is Ethereum different from any other blockchain in terms of network effects? I mean, I would say the network effects that exist are different. Like, for example, Bitcoin is just a cryptocurrency, whereas Ethereum has the cryptocurrency, but it also has the developer platform. Ethereum has applications and then users using those applications and all of these things. So the kinds of network effects that exist are definitely different from those that exist in many other platforms. I mean, what that'll actually mean in practice, I don't know.
I mean, like, when we talk about network effects, like, it's like this multiple users are getting onboarded to like one blockchain platform. And when we talk about DApps, like Ethereum is the de facto standard for DApps to be deployed in case of public blockchain platforms. So don't you think it's kind of a network effect that's happening, that all the DApps are again landing up on Ethereum?
Yeah.
Cool. We'll do one last question, and then we'll close off this session. Any last questions?
Yeah.
Hey, we got one over there. Go ahead.
Hello, Vitalik. A couple of days ago, you had proposed using Bitcoin Cash as a scalable data layer. A couple of days ago. I wanted to understand how serious are you of actually considering this as a scalability solution for Ethereum 2.2 in the short term, actually?
Like that post was definitely kind of more of a kind of, hey, look, this is possible sort of thing than a like, hey, let's throw resources behind it. Like, I mean, in practice, like, I mean, the Bitcoin Cash and the Ethereum Classic chains like do exist, and if anyone building these layer 2 systems that depend on data availability layers wants to use them, then they totally can. But like, it's definitely not my intention that like we're pinning our hopes on this approach of like linking with other blockchains for scalability, the way that some of the trolls have been kind of spinning things. Like, I even think that layer 2s for data, like especially if that instant bully IP gets in, that we might even have enough scalability just by using these layer 2s where the data layer just use the Ethereum blockchain itself, and that could easily be enough too.
With that, Vitalik, thank you so much, and wish everybody happy hacking.
Yay! Thank you for listening. Bye.